Welcome to Warriors of the World. Now close your eyes and imagine the soft sound of the wind whispering through the rice fields as cherry blossom leaves fall slowly around you. You are walking down a dirt road in feudal Japan, the sky tinged orange by the rising sun. The smell of wet earth mixes with the sweet fragrance of flowers. Ahead, an imposing figure appears. He is the one we will explore today, the samurai. His armor shines in the morning light. The ornate helmet hides his face. Beside him rests his iconic and legendary katana, a sword that legends say is unbreakable, cutting anything with millimeter precision just like modern-day samurai Isao Machi does. You see him and think, this is the perfect warrior, the defender of his honor through Bushido, the code of honor he would follow to the death. Maybe he reminds you of Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, or maybe he brings to mind the unwavering will of Samurai Jack, who crossed dimensions in his mission. But what if I told you that much of what you believe about this warrior is not just historical but also a media creation, shaped by films and series? That the idealized image of the samurai as the flawless warrior, driven by an unbreakable code of honor, might be closer to a myth than to reality? Today, we are here to break that illusion. Let's dive deep into history, peel off the masks, or kabuto helmets, and reveal who these warriors of ancient Japan truly were. The imposing armor resembling the armored shell of a crustacean? Not always worn. The code of honor? Often set aside. The indestructible katana? Nowhere near as perfect as the movies make it seem. So get ready! Throughout this video, we will demystify all of this, starting right now. Now that we've questioned the mythical image of the samurai, it's time to bring to light the reality of Japan's feudal era. Imagine yourself in the 12th century, in a divided Japan, full of conflicts, with clans fighting for power. There isn't a single centralized government, but rather a collection of feudal lords, known as daimyos, who control their lands with iron fists. It's here where the samurai emerge, not as movie heroes, but as a warrior class serving these lords, more like medieval knights than the moral warriors many imagine because of their code of ethics. Contrary to what is often seen in films and series, samurai weren't just warriors fighting for honor. They played many roles in society, many of which were far from the battlefield. Between wars, many samurai acted as administrators, tax collectors, enforcers, pimps, and even bureaucrats, ruling their lords' lands and ensuring orders were carried out. War wasn't the only thing that occupied their time. During long periods of peace, such as in the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, samurai essentially became a noble class, living under strict rules of behavior and etiquette, but far removed from the glories of the battlefield. Interestingly, the image of the samurai as a solitary, isolated fighter doesn't reflect what really happened. These warriors were part of a very complex military-political system, where alliances and loyalties could change at any moment. It was an era marked by betrayals, conspiracies, and shifts in the balance of power. In feudal Japan, loyalty was a malleable concept, often broken for strategic reasons or political ambitions. Instead of always acting in the name of honor, samurai had to, in practice, balance their actions between survival and duty. So, they weren't constantly fighting. Throughout history, during periods of peace, the samurai knew how to stay relevant. For many, this meant dedicating themselves to culture. Practicing haiku, the tea ceremony, and martial arts were daily secondary activities. Some of the most famous samurai in history, such as Miyamoto Musashi, were both artists and warriors. They painted, wrote poetry, and even philosophized about life, balancing sword and pen. Therefore, samurai were warriors, yes, but also a political and cultural class. This complexity is what makes their history so fascinating, yet at the same time so distant from the simplified view often seen on screen or in comics. Over time, the idea of Bushido, the legendary code of honor for the samurai, became romanticized, turning into a sort of absolute guide that every samurai supposedly followed with devotion. But was Bushido really what guided every step of the samurai? Imagine, for a moment, a samurai facing a life-or-death decision. Honor commands him to face the enemy head-on, without fear. But what if his life, his family's, and even his social standing are at stake? The truth is, Bushido, as we know it today, is an idealized construction, not a lived reality for all samurai. The term Bushido began to gain significance in the 16th and 17th centuries, but not in the way we imagine. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't a unified code that all samurai followed from the beginning. It was simply a collection of values and behaviors that varied greatly depending on the region, clan, and historical period, essentially molded by socio-political necessity. The famous Edo period, marked by long years of peace, was when Bushido took its more defined shape, and this happened when combat was no longer the primary focus of samurai life. Here's an interesting detail. The Bushido that so many see as an eternal code of honor didn't have a fixed set of rules. It was just a philosophy that adapted to the needs of the time. During bloody wars, survival often took precedence over honor. Betrayals, questionable alliances, and pragmatic decisions were common. Samurai loyal to their lords until death? Not exactly. Samurai frequently switched sides for a wide range of reasons, from blackmail and manipulation to ethical appeals or even pure greed. Furthermore, the concept of seppuku, the famous act of ritualistic suicide, is another myth worth debunking. Yes, some samurai committed seppuku to avoid dishonor, but this practice wasn't universal. Many samurai did everything possible to avoid death, choosing instead to continue their lives, even if it meant abandoning the idealized code of honor. It's essential to understand that Bushido, as a strict code, is largely a later invention, refined and reinterpreted over the centuries. Much of today's image of Bushido comes from a more peaceful period in Japanese history, when samurai no longer fought as often and society required new values to maintain order. Interestingly, much of what we now call Bushido was heavily influenced by Confucian and Buddhist philosophies, bringing in values like loyalty and discipline. So, while many samurai followed certain principles, such as loyalty and courage, that didn't mean they always acted like the perfect heroes we're presented with. And with that, another myth falls before us. Bushido, far from being a universal and absolute code, was actually a fluid and adaptable philosophy with countless versions. When we think of a samurai, one of the first images that comes to mind is the katana, that curved blade that seems almost magical. It's said that the katana was indestructible, could cut through anything, and was superior to all other weapons of the time. This is a myth that pop culture has helped create, especially in films and series that glorify this weapon. But the truth is a bit different. While the katana is indeed a masterpiece in terms of design and aesthetics, it was far from perfect. It was an efficient weapon, no doubt, but it also had important limitations. For starters, the katana was developed to maximize cutting ability, especially against lightly protected targets. This meant its thin, sharp blade wasn't ideal for cutting through heavy armor or battling European swords with thicker blades, as many think. Rather, it was a weapon designed to slice through flesh. Its strength lay in quick, precise cuts, but in a battle against heavy armor, the katana was never very effective. How many movies or anime have you seen where samurai slice through anything with their katana? Wooden doors, helmets, and even other swords? In reality, the katana's blade was vulnerable. If a samurai tried to force his sword against surfaces too hard, like metal, the blade could chip or even break. This happened because the steel used in the katana was forged to make it extremely sharp, but also relatively fragile if used incorrectly and without the proper technique. Another common myth is about how katanas were made. The process of forging one of these swords did indeed require a lot of knowledge and skill, but history often exaggerates the complexity of the process as if it bordered on the mystical. The technique of folding steel dozens or even hundreds of times, for example, was a way to compensate for the quality of materials available in Japan. The steel used, called tamahagane, needed to be treated in this way to remove impurities and give the blade more durability. So, instead of being a superior technology, it was more of an adaptation to the resources available. Despite these limitations, what made the katana special was undoubtedly its symbolism. It represented the spirit of the samurai and was treated as an extension of the warrior's soul. More than just a weapon of combat, it became a symbol of status and honor. But the practical reality was that in larger battles, samurai didn't rely solely on the katana. They used a variety of weapons, like spears, yari, and bows, yumi, and the katana was more of a last resort weapon, mainly used in duels. Just like any other warrior, the samurai used whatever was at hand to win, and the katana was just one part of that arsenal, not the perfect and indestructible weapon that the myths suggest. When we picture a samurai, it's easy to imagine him always in armor, ready for battle, with a shining katana by his side. But that image is far from the full truth. A samurai's life wasn't limited to combat. Many of these warriors went long periods without seeing the battlefield, dedicating themselves to a much more complex life full of other responsibilities. During the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, a time of peace that lasted more than 2 centuries, Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, and internal armed conflicts virtually ceased. The samurai, who were once indispensable warriors, had to find other ways to remain relevant in a society where war was no longer the norm. Many samurai became bureaucrats, administering their lord's lands and ensuring that the local government functioned smoothly. The loyalty and discipline they had learned on the battlefield were transferred to the world of politics and administration. The samurai had to trade their swords for scrolls and tax records. This was a common reality for many of them, acting as managers and advisors to the daimyos, feudal lords. Moreover, samurai culture flourished in other areas. With time on their hands, many turned to arts and philosophy. Samurai began practicing calligraphy, writing haiku poetry, and mastering rituals such as shinoi-u, the famous tea ceremony. These activities held great cultural and spiritual value in Japan at the time, allowing samurai to channel their discipline and focus. A famous example is Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary swordsman who, besides being one of the greatest duelists in history, also dedicated himself to painting and philosophical writing. He authored the Book of 5 Rings, still studied today by those wanting to understand military strategy and the samurai way of thinking. A samurai's life also involved constant martial arts training, but not just with the katana. They trained with other weapons like the bao, yumi, spear, yari, and even collective military tactics. Even in times of peace, they had to be prepared for any eventuality. This reinforced the idea that a samurai was, above all, a servant of his daimyo, and his duty was always to be ready, whether to fight or to govern. And let's not forget that many samurai were also farmers. In more rural regions, lower-ranking samurai often took care of land and cultivated rice to support themselves and their families. Far from the grandeur of battlefields, these warriors lived simple lives. Therefore, the life of a samurai was much richer and more multifaceted than the simple image of a warrior who lived by the sword. They were poets, administrators, artists, and even farmers. War was just one part of their existence, and in many cases, a part they could go years or even decades without experiencing. When we think of samurais in battle, the image that usually comes to mind is of epic duels between 2 warriors, their katanas flashing through the air as they face each other honorably. But in reality, samurai battles were much more complex and often quicker than these glorified fights seen in movies and series. Individual combat was rare, while victories on the battlefield depended much more on collective strategies, war tactics, and yes, even the use of weapons you might not immediately associate with samurai. To begin with, samurais rarely fought alone. Contrary to the heroic image perpetuated by pop culture, samurai were part of organized armies that included not only the warrior elite but also common soldiers, known as a shigeru. These armies used well-defined formations, planned by their commanders to ensure an advantage on the battlefield. Individual fights, which might seem so glorious in the movies, were the exception, not the rule. Battles involved thousands of men in action, and samurai fought alongside their comrades, using a wide variety of weapons. One of those weapons was the yari, the spear. Although less glamorous than the katana, the spear was extremely effective in battle, especially in group combat. The yari was a long-range weapon, used to keep the enemy at a distance and break through enemy formations. Large units of samurai armed with spears marched in formation, creating an impenetrable defensive line, something very different from the hand-to-hand combat we are accustomed to seeing on the big screen. In addition to spears, another essential weapon was the Japanese longbow, known as the yumi. The yumi was used both on horseback and on foot, and samurais were trained in the art of archery from a very young age. Instead of direct contact, many samurai battles began with a rain of arrows, and the archer units played a decisive role in combat. One of the biggest myths about samurai is that they never used firearms. However, nothing could be further from the truth. In the 16th century, samurai began incorporating arquebus, primitive firearms brought by Portuguese traders, into their battle tactics. Many films and series completely ignore this part of history, preferring to keep samurai in a purely medieval context, but the truth is that they were quite pragmatic when it came to adopting new technologies. The use of arquebus transformed military tactics of the time, and samurai did not hesitate to use them. Another point worth mentioning is that samurai battles weren't always fought in open fields, as many movies show. Many conflicts took place in fortresses, where defense and siege tactics were essential. Himeji Castle, for example, is one of the greatest symbols of samurai military engineering. These fortresses were designed to withstand prolonged attacks, and often victory was decided by siege strategy and control of supplies. Therefore, the true face of the samurai battlefield was much more strategic and organized than the individualistic and romantic vision we are used to. Samurai were masters of collective warfare, using formations, varied weapons, and advanced strategies to win. In the end, victory on the battlefield depended not only on individual skill but on coordination and the ability to act as part of a whole. A very different reality from the one-on-one duel that's part of the popular imagination. When we think of samurai, one of the most exalted traits is their unwavering loyalty. The image of the samurai who faithfully follows his lord to the death is widely spread. But was this loyalty always as strong as it seems? History tells us a very different reality, full of betrayals, intrigues, and pragmatic decisions that often went against the ideal of honor and loyalty. In feudal Japan, where political alliances were volatile and power often changed hands, the concept of loyalty wasn't like the movies and series tend to show. In fact, what guided many samurai was something much more practical: survival. If a political alliance stopped being advantageous, or if their lord fell from grace, the samurai's loyalty was tested. A classic example of betrayal in samurai history is the famous case of Akechi Mitsuhide, who betrayed one of the most powerful lords in Japanese history, Oda Nobunaga. Mitsuhide, one of Nobunaga's trusted generals, turned against him in 1582, leading to the siege and eventual death of the lord. Nobunaga, who was at the height of his power and known for his military conquests, was surprised by this betrayal. Mitsuhide's action demonstrates that even among the highest trusted samurai, loyalty could be broken if the opportunity for power arose. And it wasn't just Mitsuhide. Japanese history is full of cases where samurai changed sides when it served their interests better. During the Sengoku period, the Warring States era, which was one of the most chaotic times in Japanese history, betrayals were almost a constant element of power struggles. Entire clans shifted alliances based on their interests, and samurai often had to choose between guaranteeing their survival by swearing loyalty to a new master. This doesn't mean loyalty wasn't valued. It was, and highly so. The problem is that, in a world where political and military survival was everything, the idea of loyalty was flexible. Many samurai pledged their loyalty to whoever paid them better or offered the best chances of success, not to an abstract concept of honor. When the balance of power shifted, so did loyalties. Another interesting aspect is that the famous practice of seppuku, the ritual act of taking one's own life, often associated with the idea of maintaining honor in the face of defeat, was more the exception than the rule. Many samurai preferred to find ways to avoid death and live to fight another day, or even serve another lord. Once again, survival was a priority. Instead of committing seppuku out of loyalty to a defeated lord, many samurai simply negotiated. These examples show that, contrary to the legends and movies, samurai loyalty wasn't an absolute rule. Pragmatism and the desire to survive in turbulent times often spoke louder. So, another myth falls. Samurai, far from being always faithful and devoted, were also political strategists who needed to play the game of power to ensure their survival and positions. To start, did you know that not all samurai were men? While male warriors dominated the battlefields, there were also the onabugeisha, female samurai who trained in martial arts and fought to defend their lands and families. One of the most famous was Tomo Guzan, a legendary 12th century warrior known for her bravery and skill with both sword and bow. These women prove that the warrior spirit of feudal Japan wasn't limited to the male gender, and that women played important roles in times of war. What about the more spiritual side of samurai? Beyond battles, many samurai sought balance between body and mind. They dedicated themselves to practices such as Zen meditation and Buddhism, which helped them remain calm under pressure and face death with serenity. This philosophical side of the samurai was an important part of their lives, showing that the warrior's path wasn't just about fighting but also about reaching a state of inner peace. Another interesting curiosity is that the process of forging a katana wasn't just a craft but also almost a ritualistic practice. The blacksmith responsible for creating a katana followed religious rituals to purify the blade, believing that the spirit of the warrior would be imbued in the sword. Additionally, the sword was often passed down from generation to generation as a family heirloom, carrying with it the history and achievements of their ancestors. Samurai training began early and wasn't limited to just physical combat. Besides learning to use various weapons, samurai were also taught strategy, military tactics, and even poetry. The idea that a samurai should be both a warrior and a scholar was a central part of their education. This balanced view between war and culture helped form a complex figure, capable of fighting, governing, and also reflecting on life and death. Samurai also had to deal with the concept of retirement. During long periods of peace, like the Edo period, many samurai moved away from fighting and focused on other occupations, such as farming and bureaucracy. Some became monks, seeking a life of contemplation after years dedicated to the battlefield. These are just a few of the many fascinating details that show samurai were much more than just warriors with swords. They were complex figures, involved in a rich cultural life and full of responsibilities that went far beyond war. Every aspect of their lives was proof that the samurai's path wasn't just about fighting but about living with purpose and wisdom. Samurai have been, for decades, a central figure in pop culture. From epic films to series and animations, these warriors have become icons of honor, skill, and loyalty. However, with this popularization came many distortions and exaggerations, which ended up creating a romanticized and often unrealistic image of these warriors. One of the most famous films that helped solidify the modern image of the samurai was The Last Samurai, 2003, starring Tom Cruise. The film was a huge success and remains one of the strongest references when it comes to samurai in cinema. In it, we see an ex-American soldier who, after being captured by a group of samurai, learns from them the values of Bushido and becomes a fervent defender of their cause. The film portrays samurai as the last defenders of a pure and noble tradition, in contrast to a Japan that modernizes and adopts Western methods. However, despite being visually impressive and emotionally captivating, The Last Samurai exaggerates the concept of honor and loyalty. Another iconic example is the animated series Samurai Jack, which debuted in 2001 and became a cult classic. Although it's an animation full of fiction and fantasy, Samurai Jack reinforces the image of the solitary warrior, wandering through desolate lands in search of justice, with his katana in hand. Despite being an excellent series in terms of visuals and narrative, Samurai Jack ends up cementing the idea that samurai were always solitary and invincible heroes, which doesn't align with historical reality. Besides films and series, samurai are also the protagonists in video games, such as the popular Ghost of Tsushima, 2020. The game is widely praised for its stunning visual recreation of feudal Japan and how it immerses the player in samurai culture. However, like most entertainment works, the focus is on heroic duels and combat scenes, where the protagonist faces entire armies alone. But don't think that pop culture only gets it wrong. There are also works that try to show samurai in a more raw and realistic light. The legendary director Akira Kurosawa, in films like Seven Samurai, 1954, brought a more realistic vision of these warriors, showing samurai as flawed men dealing with the complexities of their loyalties and responsibilities. Instead of only portraying the glory of battle, Kurosawa shows us the hard lives of samurai and how they had to make complex decisions. Therefore, pop culture, while giving us epic and memorable stories, ends up simplifying the history of samurai, focusing only on the heroic elements and ignoring the nuances and contradictions that truly define this warrior class. And now that we've debunked so many ideas about the samurai, one question remains. In the end, what were they? Heroes or villains? The truth is that, like any historical figure, samurai can't fit into a single definition. Throughout this video, we've seen that they could be honorable warriors, yes, but also political strategists, often forced to make choices that went against the ideal of honor that we so strongly associate with them. On one hand, their devotion to Bushido and their skill with the sword turned them into legends. On the other hand, their involvement in betrayals, violent wars, and political maneuvers challenges this image of purity and absolute loyalty. We can't forget that, in times of peace, many samurai adapted to administrative, cultural, and even agricultural roles. This doesn't make them any less warriors, but it reminds us that they were as human as any of us. And here's the reflection I want to leave you with, dear viewer. Were these warriors, who have inspired works around the world, really heroes? Or were they villains, ready to betray, kill, and do whatever it took to stay in power? Perhaps they were both. Perhaps this duality is what makes the history of samurais so fascinating. They are, at once, symbols of virtue and agents of the brutal reality of a Japan in constant conflict. In the end, there is no easy answer. Just like the katana, which is both a lethal weapon and a work of art, samurai also carry this duality. The question that remains is, which side do you choose to see? The hero who lives by honor or the strategist who fights for survival? Think about it and share your opinion in the comments. And don't forget, we still have much more to explore about our soldiers here on Warriors of the World. Subscribe to the channel to continue with us on this fascinating journey through history and the epic battles of the warriors who have shaped and continue to shape our culture and society. See you in the next episode here on Warriors of the World.